I knew something was wrong the moment the sirens echoed through the pine trees and painted my cabin walls red and blue like a Christmas decoration nobody asked for. My boots crunched over the gravel as I stepped out of my truck, the cool mountain air carrying the smell of pine sap and cold lake water drifting up from the valley about half a mile below. I had just driven 3 hours from the nearest regional airport, the kind of quiet drive where the road snakes through forest for miles without a single stoplight, and the only thing you expect to see at the end of it is your own porch light glowing against the dark. Instead, I found 3 sheriff's cruisers parked crooked along my gravel driveway, and a woman standing beside them with her arms folded like she owned the mountain. Linda Whitmore, HOA president of the brand-new subdivision they'd carved into the hillside 2 years ago, a development full of identical vacation homes that looked like they'd been copied and pasted from a real estate brochure. My cabin had been here long before any of that. My grandfather built it in 1974 with cedar beams hauled up the ridge in the back of a pickup truck, back when this whole valley was just logging roads and fishing trails. The porch still creaked in the same spots it did when I was 10 years old, and the brass lantern beside the door still smelled faintly of kerosene when the wind shifted just right. I had barely shut my truck door when Linda pointed straight at me like she'd been rehearsing the moment all day. "That's him," she said loudly enough for everyone within 50 yards to hear. "That's the man trespassing on HOA property." The words hung in the mountain air for a second, almost absurd against the quiet rustle of wind through the pines. One of the deputies shifted his weight on the gravel. Another glanced up at the cabin like he was trying to piece together how a place that old could possibly belong to a subdivision that hadn't existed 5 years ago. I didn't say anything. I just stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, taking in the scene the way you do when you've spent enough years working in government to recognize a situation that's about to get awkward for somebody. Linda mistook my silence for hesitation. Her chin lifted a little higher. "I told you he'd come back," she said, her voice full of that polished confidence people get when they believe the rules are always on their side. "This property was absorbed into the HOA boundary last year. He was notified." I watched a breeze ripple across the lake below, turning the surface silver in the fading afternoon light. Funny thing about mountain property lines. They tend to matter a lot more than people realize. And funny thing about assumptions. Sometimes the man standing quietly in front of his own cabin isn't the one who's about to have a very long evening. My name is Daniel Carter, and for most people passing through this part of the state, I am just another guy with an old cabin tucked into the trees. The road that leads up here is barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass each other, a narrow ribbon of gravel that climbs the ridge for almost 2 miles before the forest finally opens into the small clearing where my grandfather decided to build. Back in 1974, this place was nothing more than timberland and quiet water. My grandfather, Samuel Carter, was a machinist who spent 40 years fixing equipment for the county highway department, and when he finally saved enough money, he bought 10 acres on this ridge because he said the lake below looked like a sheet of polished steel at sunrise. He hauled the lumber himself in an old Ford pickup, measuring every beam twice and driving every nail with the slow patience of a man who knew he was building something meant to outlast him. My father grew up here learning how to split firewood and patch the roof after winter storms rolled down from the mountains, and when I was a kid, this cabin was where our family disappeared every summer weekend. The smell of cedar boards warming in the sun, the soft creak of the dock down by the water, the sound of loons echoing across the lake at dusk. Those things stay with you longer than most people realize. After my grandfather passed away, the property came down to my father, and eventually to me, along with every faded survey document and tax record that proved exactly where the Carter land began and where it ended. I never turned the place into anything fancy. No new decks, no rental listings, no vacation brochures promising luxury wilderness experiences. Just the same cabin sitting under the same tall pines, with a gravel driveway that crunches under your tires the same way it did 30 years ago. My job keeps me on the road more often than I would like, traveling between federal offices and regional agencies that most people never hear about. So sometimes months go by before I get the chance to drive back up here and unlock the door again. That quiet distance from the world is the whole point. Or at least it used to be. 2 years ago, the land across the ridge was sold to a development company out of Denver, and within months bulldozers started carving neat roads into the hillside like someone drawing grid lines across a map. Then came the identical houses, the stone entrance gate, the glossy signs promising luxury mountain living. And with that development came the homeowners association that Linda Whitmore now ran like she had been elected mayor of the forest. The first letter from the association showed up last fall while I was working 3 states away, a thick envelope full of polite language explaining that my cabin appeared to fall inside the newly defined community boundary. The letter suggested membership fees, architectural guidelines, and shared property responsibilities that would supposedly benefit everyone in the area. I remember standing in a government office hallway reading that letter under fluorescent lights and thinking someone in that office building had made a very confident assumption about land that had been in my family since before their subdivision existed. I filed the letter away, finished the work trip, and drove back to the cabin a few weeks later expecting to enjoy a quiet weekend by the lake. Instead, I found a fresh wooden sign hammered beside my driveway that read Whitmore Ridge Estates Private Community. That was the moment I realized the new neighbors on the other side of the ridge had plans that went well beyond polite invitations. The first time I met Linda Whitmore was on a bright October afternoon when the leaves around the lake had turned the kind of deep orange that makes the whole hillside look like it is glowing. I had just finished stacking a new line of firewood beside the cabin when I heard the distant hum of an electric golf cart coming up the gravel road, which was strange because the road had never seen anything like that before the subdivision arrived. The cart rolled slowly into the clearing and stopped beside the wooden sign near my driveway. Linda stepped out like she was arriving for a ribbon-cutting ceremony, dressed in a crisp white jacket and sunglasses that reflected the trees around her. She carried a clipboard tucked neatly under one arm and wore the expression of someone who believed the entire valley was now part of her responsibility. She introduced herself with a practiced smile and said she was the president of the Whitmore Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, speaking each word slowly as if the title carried the same authority as a government office. The smell of fresh paint drifted from the new subdivision entrance sign down the road, and I could hear the faint buzz of construction equipment somewhere beyond the ridge where more houses were going up. Linda walked a slow circle around the edge of my clearing, glancing at the cabin, the woodshed, and the path that led down toward the lake like she was mentally measuring every inch of the property. She explained that the development company had recently finalized the master boundary plan for the community and that several surrounding parcels had been incorporated into the neighborhood to maintain what she called aesthetic continuity. That phrase sounded like it had been copied directly from a brochure. According to Linda, the association would soon be responsible for maintaining access roads, regulating exterior structures, and ensuring that every property followed the same architectural guidelines that the new homeowners expected when they bought into the development. She pointed toward my cabin and said the board had already discussed several improvements that might bring the structure up to community standards. A different roof color, perhaps a stone walkway, maybe even a redesigned deck so that the building matched the style of the homes on the ridge. I remember watching a red leaf drift slowly across the surface of the lake while she spoke, letting her finish the entire speech without interrupting. Linda eventually paused and waited for a response, her smile tightening slightly when she realized I had not picked up the clipboard she was holding out. I told her that the cabin had been standing there long before the subdivision existed and that my family had no plans to redesign it to match houses built 50 years later. The quiet in the clearing lasted a few seconds longer than she expected. Linda nodded politely, but the expression behind her sunglasses shifted into something colder, something that suggested she was not used to hearing the word no from anyone living within driving distance of her new entrance gate. She said the association would send official documentation outlining the next steps, and then climbed back into her golf cart, the electric motor humming softly as she drove away down the gravel road. The moment the sound faded into the trees, I had the distinct feeling that the conversation had not ended at all. It had simply moved to the next phase. Over the next few months, the letters started arriving with the regular precision of a billing statement, each envelope stamped with the neat blue logo of Whitmore Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The first one was polite, printed on thick paper with friendly language explaining that my property had been identified as a participating parcel within the expanded community boundary and that membership paperwork had been included for my convenience. The next letter was less friendly. It outlined the monthly association fee, the architectural guidelines, and a deadline for compliance that suggested the board believed the matter had already been settled. I kept every one of those envelopes in a drawer beside the kitchen table, sliding them neatly into a folder the same way my father used to organize property tax receipts. Every time I drove back to the cabin after another work trip, I would find another letter waiting inside the old mailbox by the road. The pattern never changed. New rules, new requests, new reminders that the neighborhood expected cooperation from every property owner within its reach. One weekend in early spring, I arrived to find something different standing beside the gravel driveway. Someone had planted a fresh white post in the ground about 20 feet from the road. A rectangular metal sign hung from the top of it, bright and polished like it had been installed that morning. The words read Whitmore Ridge Estates Private Access Road. I stood there for a moment listening to the wind moving through the tall pines, while the lake shimmered quietly below the ridge. The gravel road beneath my boots had been poured and graded by the county back in the 1970s, long before any subdivision map existed for this hillside. Yet here was a brand new sign announcing that the road belonged to someone else now. I pulled the post out of the ground that afternoon and leaned it carefully against the side of the woodshed. I did not damage it, and I did not throw it away. I simply set it aside like a misplaced tool waiting for the person who owned it to come pick it up. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived explaining that unauthorized removal of association property could result in additional administrative review. The tone had changed again. The sentences were shorter. The friendly language had disappeared. A few days after that, I noticed survey flags appearing along the edge of the clearing, thin strips of orange plastic tied to wooden stakes that marked a new boundary line running straight across the edge of my driveway. I knew exactly where my property lines were. My grandfather had measured them with a transit the year the cabin was built, and the county survey documents had not moved a single inch since then. Still, someone from the subdivision had decided to redraw the map anyway. When I called the number listed on the association letterhead, the receptionist told me the board was simply standardizing land records for the benefit of the community. She said the president believed the matter would resolve itself once every homeowner understood their responsibilities. That phrase stuck with me as I hung up the phone, because from where I stood, looking out across the lake and the quiet forest that had been here for decades, it seemed the only thing being standardized was Linda Whitmore's assumption that if she repeated a claim often enough, eventually everyone would start believing it. The situation finally reached its strange turning point on a quiet Friday afternoon in late May when I drove up the ridge expecting nothing more dramatic than a peaceful evening by the lake. The sky was clear, the air carried that warm pine scent that usually settles over the mountains before sunset, and the gravel road looked exactly the way it always had for the past 40 years. At least until I reached the final bend before the clearing. A brand new metal chain had been stretched across the entrance to my driveway, hooked between two bright steel posts that had definitely not been there the week before. The chain hung about 3 feet off the ground with a polished padlock in the center, and attached to it was another sign printed in bold red letters that read Private HOA Property, No Unauthorized Access. I stepped out of the truck and stood there for a moment with the engine ticking quietly behind me as it cooled. The cabin roof was visible through the trees about 100 yards ahead, sitting exactly where it had always been, but now someone had decided that the road leading to it belonged to the subdivision on the other side of the ridge. I walked up to the chain and looked closer at the posts. Fresh concrete still ringed the base of both supports, meaning someone had installed them that morning or perhaps the night before. Whoever did it had not bothered to ask permission. They had simply declared the road part of their community and acted like the decision had already been approved by the rest of the world. I took a slow breath of the cool mountain air and reached into my pocket for the small key ring I carried with the cabin keys. The chain was not mine, and neither was the padlock, so I did not touch it. Instead, I turned around and leaned back against the hood of the truck, listening to the wind moving through the forest and watching the quiet water of the lake glint between the trees below. About 15 minutes later, I heard the familiar electric whine of a golf cart coming up the road from the direction of the subdivision. Linda Whitmore appeared around the bend exactly the way she had months earlier, sunglasses in place, posture straight, clipboard resting against her arm like it was a badge of authority. She slowed the cart when she saw me standing beside the chain and gave a satisfied nod that suggested the scene unfolding in front of her was exactly what she had been expecting. She explained that the association board had voted earlier that week to restrict access to private community roads until all surrounding property owners finalized their membership agreements. According to Linda, the chain was a temporary measure designed to protect neighborhood security while legal documentation was processed. I looked past her toward the new houses, rising along the ridge and the stone entrance gate that now marked the beginning of Whitmore Ridge Estates. Then I looked back at the chain blocking the driveway that had belonged to my family since before most of those houses existed on paper. Linda waited for an argument, or perhaps a complaint she could record on her clipboard. Instead, I simply nodded once and said I understood her position. The small pause that followed seemed to confuse her more than any argument would have. Because the one thing Linda Whitmore did not expect in that moment was a quiet man choosing not to fight over a chain that was about to become someone else's very expensive mistake. I left the chain exactly where Linda Whitmore had placed it and drove back down the gravel road that evening without another word. The sun had already dipped behind the ridge, turning the lake below into a long sheet of dark copper, and the quiet hum of my truck engine echoed through the trees as I headed toward the main highway about 12 miles away. Anyone watching from the subdivision might have assumed the situation had resolved itself. From their perspective, the homeowner who refused to join their association had finally backed down. That assumption, like most of the others they had made over the past year, was built on very incomplete information. The following Monday morning, I was sitting in a federal office building nearly 200 miles away, a place where the hallways smelled faintly of fresh coffee and copier toner instead of pine sap and lake water. My desk overlooked a wide stretch of city traffic moving slowly through downtown, and the quiet hum of government work carried on around me the same way it always did. Reports moved across desks, emails arrived, and regional briefings were scheduled weeks in advance. My job rarely involved the kind of dramatic situations people imagine when they hear the words federal oversight, but it did require a steady understanding of jurisdiction, property records, and the complicated relationships between local agencies and the offices that supervise them. That morning, I opened the same folder where I had been keeping the Homeowners Association letters for months. Inside were copies of every notice, every boundary claim, every polite demand for membership fees. I placed them beside the original survey maps from 1974, the county. Land records that clearly marked the 10 acres my grandfather purchased long before Whitmore Ridge Estates appeared on anyone's blueprint. The comparison was not complicated. One set of documents described land that had been registered with the county for half a century. The other described a newly drawn neighborhood boundary created by a private association that believed its influence extended farther than it actually did. I made 2 phone calls that morning. The first was to the county records office that still maintained the original survey files for the Ridge property. The clerk confirmed what I already knew. The Carter parcel had not moved a single inch since the day it was recorded. The second call was to a regional administrative office responsible for reviewing property access disputes that involved public roads and emergency services. The gravel road leading to my cabin had been listed for decades as a county-maintained access route, meaning no private association could legally restrict it without proper authorization. I thanked the office staff for their time and closed the folder on my desk. By the end of the week, I scheduled a short visit back to the cabin. The drive would take about 3 hours, the same quiet highway winding through farmland and foothills until the pavement finally narrowed into the old gravel road climbing toward the ridge. I suspected that by the time I reached the clearing again, the chain across my driveway would still be hanging there exactly where Linda Whitmore had left it, and I also suspected that someone from the subdivision might be waiting nearby, confident that the situation had already been decided in their favor. What none of them realized yet was that the chain across that road had quietly transformed a small neighborhood dispute into a much larger jurisdictional question, one that involved offices far beyond the entrance gate of Whitmore Ridge Estates. I returned to the ridge 3 days later, just after noon, the truck tires grinding slowly over the same gravel road that had carried my family up this hill for half a century. The sky was bright and clear, the kind of quiet mountain afternoon where the wind moves gently through the tall pines, and the lake below reflects the sun like polished glass. From the final curve in the road, I could already see the chain stretched across the entrance to my driveway exactly where Linda Whitmore had left it. The metal links hung loose between the 2 steel posts, the red sign still swaying slightly in the breeze, as if it were proud of the message it carried. Private HOA property, no unauthorized access. What caught my attention first, however, was not the chain. It was the pair of sheriff department vehicles parked 20 yards beyond it. The white cruisers sat angled along the edge of the clearing with their doors closed and their light bars dark, but the presence was obvious enough. Linda had decided not to wait for another quiet conversation beside a golf cart. She had escalated the situation. I rolled the truck to a stop on the gravel and stepped out, the scent of warm pine needles and lake water drifting through the clearing. Linda Whitmore stood near the front of the nearest patrol vehicle, wearing the same confident posture she always carried, clipboard in one hand, sunglasses reflecting the trees. Beside her stood a tall man in a sheriff department uniform whose badge caught the sunlight each time he shifted his stance. Even from a distance I could tell by the way they stood close together that they were more than strangers sharing a roadside discussion. Linda spoke first the moment I closed the truck door. She announced loudly that the Homeowners Association had contacted the county sheriff department because an individual had repeatedly attempted to access private community roads without authorization. Her tone carried the same rehearsed authority I had heard months earlier during our first conversation beside the cabin. The deputy listened patiently while she explained the situation, occasionally glancing toward the chain across my driveway, and then back toward the cabin roof visible through the trees beyond it. I walked slowly up to the barrier and stopped a few feet away, letting the gravel settle under my boots. The deputy finally turned toward me and asked in a calm professional voice whether I was the owner of the cabin beyond the chain. I answered that I was. Linda immediately began explaining again that the property now fell under the authority of Whitmore Ridge Estates and that access had been restricted until all membership documentation was completed. The deputy nodded politely while she spoke. Then he looked at me and asked if I had any documentation confirming ownership of the parcel. I reached into the truck and retrieved the thin leather folder I had brought with me from the office earlier that morning. Inside were the original county survey copies, the property tax records, and several documents that rarely needed to leave a government desk. The deputy opened the folder and scanned the first page. The moment his eyes reached the signature line at the bottom, his expression changed slightly, the quiet recognition of someone suddenly realizing the situation standing in front of him was not as simple as it first appeared. Linda Whitmore had been watching confidently until that exact moment. Then the deputy slowly lifted his head and looked from the documents in his hands to the man standing beside the chain across the road. The deputy held the folder for several quiet seconds while the wind moved through the trees around us, the sound of pine branches brushing together high above the clearing like a slow whisper across the ridge. I watched his eyes move from the survey map to the county seal printed along the edge of the document, and finally to the final page where the signature line rested beneath a government letterhead that most people in the county rarely saw up close. His posture shifted slightly as the recognition settled in. The confidence that had been sitting comfortably on Linda Whitmore's face began to fade the moment she noticed the change. She stepped closer to the deputy and asked if there was a problem with the paperwork. The deputy did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the folder carefully and looked back at me with the cautious expression of someone recalculating a situation that had just become more complicated than expected. He asked one quiet question, addressing me by my last name with a tone that carried a hint of professional respect. I confirmed the title printed on the page and nodded once. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer in the still mountain air. Linda glanced from the deputy to me and then back again, clearly waiting for someone to confirm that the Homeowners Association had been correct all along. Instead, the deputy cleared his throat and spoke in a calm voice that sounded very different from the one he had used earlier. He explained that the road running up the ridge had been listed in county access records for decades and that restricting entry with a private barrier could create complications for emergency response routes. Linda immediately began objecting, insisting that the association had authority over the entire boundary shown on their community development plan. The deputy listened patiently, but did not argue. He simply opened the folder again and turned it so she could see the official survey record and the administrative header printed across the top of the second page. I watched her expression shift as she tried to process the information in front of her. The wind lifted the edge of the paper slightly, and the red Homeowners Association sign creaked behind us on its chain. Linda asked what the document meant, and the deputy answered with the careful tone of someone explaining a mistake that had already traveled too far to quietly ignore. The property beyond the chain had not been absorbed into any private development boundary. It remained an independently registered parcel connected to a public access route recognized by county infrastructure records. The deputy then added something else, something he had only noticed after reading the final page of the folder. The administrative office listed on the letterhead belonged to a regional oversight department that worked directly with several local agencies in the county, including the sheriff department itself. The moment that explanation finished, the air in the clearing seemed to change. Linda Whitmore stood perfectly still beside the patrol vehicle, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side as the realization slowly reached her. The chain across the road had not blocked a random cabin owner from entering his property. It had blocked a man whose office regularly reviewed reports submitted by the same department she had just called to remove him. The clearing stayed quiet for several seconds after the deputy finished speaking, the kind of silence that only happens in the mountains when everyone suddenly realizes the conversation has taken a direction nobody planned for. Linda Whitmore looked from the document in the deputy's hands to the cabin beyond the trees, as if she were seeing the entire ridge differently for the first time. The wind lifted a few pine needles across the gravel, while the red sign, hanging on the chain, creaked softly back and forth. The deputy closed the folder again and handed it back to me with a small nod that carried more respect than the situation had started with. Then he turned slightly toward Linda and explained, in a calm and professional tone, that placing a barrier across a county-recognized access road could create legal complications for the Homeowners Association if emergency services were ever delayed or obstructed. Linda tried once more to insist that the association board had authority to manage community boundaries, but the confidence in her voice had thinned considerably. The deputy listened patiently and then pointed to the concrete posts and the locked chain across the road. He said that before the situation created further confusion, it would probably be best for the barrier to be removed and for the association to review the official county records before making additional changes to the property lines around the ridge. For the first time since I had met her, Linda Whitmore did not have a prepared response waiting on the clipboard in her hand. She looked down the road toward the entrance gate of Whitmore Ridge Estates, and then back toward the quiet cabin that had been standing on the hillside since long before the subdivision existed. A few moments later, she stepped forward and unlocked the padlock from the chain. The metal links slid quietly to the gravel as she lowered them between the two posts, clearing the road that had never belonged to the association in the first place. Neither of us said much after that. The deputy returned to his patrol vehicle, the engine starting with a low rumble before the cruiser slowly turned back toward the main road. Linda gathered the chain and sign from the driveway and set them carefully in the back of her golf cart without making eye contact. When she finally drove away, the electric motor faded into the forest the same way it had the first day we met months earlier. I stood alone in the clearing for a moment, listening to the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. Then I walked up the gravel driveway to the cabin door and unlocked it with the same key my grandfather used nearly 50 years ago. The porch boards creaked under my boots exactly the way they always had, and the lake below the ridge shimmered quietly in the late afternoon sun. Some people believe authority is something you have to announce loudly in order for others to recognize it. The truth is much simpler than that. Real authority usually arrives quietly, printed in the right place on the right piece of paper, and by the time anyone realizes what it means, the argument has already ended.